And I've come to believe, Christy, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but the federal agencies have now outgrown the federal government in terms of the overseers. Congress can't really do anything and doesn't do anything meaningful about the abuses by federal agencies because they're co opted, both Democrat and Republican Party leaders, through donations and all kinds of influence. And really, they're not running the show anymore. These bureaucracies that are committing the abuses are in charge. But I noticed in the mid 2000s, talking about 2006 on, we started hiring these propagandists in the newsroom. So they were no longer simply influencing us from the outside. They were becoming editors, managers, writers, producers, and actually having an impact. They were becoming us. And that's why now when news organizations do things that are totally unjournalistic from the sense of what we learned in journalism school, they're rarely punished for it or held responsible. And in fact, those journalists are often promoted and go on to make more money and get bigger jobs because they're actually accomplishing the propagandist goal. Journalism isn't their goal. And that's the only way to understand why so much misreporting can happen and so many journalism rules can be violated without anybody doing much about it.
She's an Emmy award-winning investigative journalist, Sharyl Attkisson. She is a New York Times best-selling author. She's written Stonewall, Smear, and most recently Slanted: How the News Media Taught Us to Love Censorship and Hate Journalism. Clearly, all those books resonate with me for good reason. For 30 years, Attkisson was a correspondent and anchor at CBS News, PBS, CNN, and in local news. Currently, she hosts Sinclair's Full Measure with Sharyl Attkisson, which feeds to more than 43 million U.S. households each week and focuses on investigative and accountability reporting. Sharyl, thank you so much for coming on with me again. I had you on shortly after I went independent and I kind of fangirled out on you. So this time I'm going to try and keep that in check. You look like you're enjoying a beautiful day. So let's start there.
Well, I am. I'm in Florida and I'm working, but what better place to work? It doesn't even feel like you're on the job when you're in beautiful, sunny Florida.
Yes. So let's start off with your observations of how the approach to journalism with integrity, how you think that's evolved over the years in your experience. Do you think there's always been issues with corporate and government influence, and maybe we're just more aware of it, or how do you think that's evolved?
Well, there have always been some issues. There have always been filters and some interference. And I could tell stories from 30 years ago, incidents where that came into play. But there's no doubt that starting around the 2016 time period, things kind of went out of control as far as what we considered traditional journalism. And I began to notice that on the front or the leading edge as an investigative reporter at CBS News, because the types of reporting that I was doing the kind of stories that people were trying to stop: corporate interests and special interests that had some financial stake, maybe 2 or 3 steps removed from what I felt I was reporting on at the moment. But they have ways, through the magic of the internet and social media and multi-billion-dollar firms that they employ, LLCs and PR firms, crisis management firms, nonprofits, that all can be used to try to shape the narrative and smear or discredit people who present facts or follow leads that are off the narrative. That's been a huge change. The internet made a lot of it possible. And then, if you don't mind, sorry for the long-winded answer, but Donald Trump was the excuse they needed to jump forward in a very overt way. The media then said publicly, led by the New York Times, we're going to suspend our normal ethics and standards for journalism because we consider Donald Trump uniquely dangerous. Well, there's reasons why they consider him uniquely dangerous, because he was a threat to the establishment narratives and the establishment money. But that aside, there's never a more important time to maintain our journalism standards and ethics than when we don't like somebody that we're reporting on. That's why these standards exist. And so it was so contrary to everything I learned coming up 30, 40 years ago, the way journalism is practiced today.
For me, it was 2020, and we had those two main stories, the pandemic and the presidential election, and just suddenly everything was more sensationalized. There was adjectives all thrown in, and like you, maybe some of these little things were happening along the way, but that's when it really opened my eyes to just how bad it had become. But did you ever think that we would come to a point to where even the Poynter Institute, which is supposed to be all about ethical journalism, is saying that there should be no objectivity in news? This blows my mind.
Well, the Poynter Institute has long been compromised. And as I've written about in my books, any mode of influence that you can name has been subjected to these kinds of influences and powers that we're talking about. They figured it out. They know that they had to go to academic institutions, news organizations, journalism organizations, political institutions, government institutions. They understood those who want to control what we report and say and see and the opinions that we form. They understand what they had to do, and they've been working on this control for a long time. It used to be more from the outside, in my experience, where they would try to influence the stories that we report. But I noticed in the mid 2000s, talking about 2006 on, we started hiring these propagandists in the newsroom. So they were no longer simply influencing us from the outside. They were becoming editors, managers, writers, producers, and actually having an impact. They were becoming us. And that's why now when news organizations do things that are totally unjournalistic from the sense of what we learned in journalism school, they're rarely punished for it or held responsible. And in fact, those journalists are often promoted and go on to make more money and get bigger jobs because they're actually accomplishing the propagandist goal. Journalism isn't their goal. And that's the only way to understand why so much misreporting can happen and so many journalism rules can be violated without anybody doing much about it.
Now, the concept of this show, brand new, is to bring the other side, which means I do elevate the counter narrative, but that is in an effort to bring more balance to the table overall. I noticed that you do that a little bit as well, like as far as on your website, you have a whole censored section. So is that also your thought behind it, that like, hey, yes, I may be now elevating one side, but if our goal as journalists is to bring overall balance, is that kind of how you look at it as well?
It is, because I think all information should be available. And it was quite a clever maneuver that the propagandists were able to accomplish to get us in the 2016 time period for the first time to cheer on the notion of censorship and third parties curating our information so that we dare not see certain things, don't even show us or tell us this information is available. We weren't clamoring for that prior to 2016. That's not what anybody ever wanted. And now people embrace it. Journalism groups embrace it. News organizations say it's our job to tell you, not to tell you certain things. Well, I disagree. I think all the information should be out there. It's up to us to sift through and form our own conclusions, except that which is illegal. Very rarely there's something that we shouldn't publish or tell because there's some law that it violates, but that's very rare. So yes, my job has begun more about, I cover many stories fairly the way the media doesn't cover typically anymore. So you'll just see both sides of a story, which is unusual now on many controversies. But yes, I also do try to elevate the sides that powerful interests are trying to cover up or not let you hear about. It may be a study, peer-reviewed published studies that they don't want you to see. It may be a conservative point or a liberal viewpoint. Sometimes these converge now on these censorship issues. And yes, I try to make those viewpoints available so that people can have full information to make up their own minds.
Right. Now, I wanted to get into some of your great books. I'm actually rereading Smeared because, as you know, investigative journalism, independent journalism is very time consuming. So I try and read it when I can, and I almost finished it before, and I gave up and I started it all over again. But anyways, your book Stonewalled actually details essentially how you were targeted by the government when trying to investigate stories during the Obama administration. So can you tell me or tell our viewers how you discovered you were essentially being spied on, right?
Well, this was before we knew this was so routinely being done. But I got two tips from separate people. I don't think they knew each other, and I didn't know them very well in the intel community that suggested I was probably being monitored, as they put it, because of the report that I was doing. And it sounded very far fetched initially because we'd never heard of such a thing, but it was within a couple of months that the spying on the Associated Press came out, the spying on James Rosen of Fox News came out, all kinds of stories. The NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden revealed that we were being spied on in ways the government had denied by the millions and multi-millions of people at a time. But when I first was told, given this tip, it just sounded very far-fetched. And yet I had contacts and resources who offered to look at my computers because that's how they said the monitoring would be done. And long story short, we fairly quickly had many independent forensic reviews of my CBS computers and my home computers that revealed a long-term government monitoring effort, including keystroke monitoring, looking into my files, accessing the CBS News system, which CBS issued a press release about at the time, by the way. There's no doubt this happened, despite the propaganda that was spun out afterwards to make it seem as though none of it had happened. And I'm still suing because, of course, the Department of Justice and FBI will not hold their own accountable, which is one of the biggest crimes this nation has ever seen. The fact that the criminals are in our government and will not prosecute themselves. And so I filed a civil case supported by some Fourth Amendment legal advocates, not press advocates, interestingly enough, but some lawyers and attorneys on both left and right who think this is one of the biggest crimes they've ever seen. And so I'm still suing. It's an uphill battle to sue the Department of Justice when they hold the information that one needs to prove the case. And the deck is stacked against you more or less, but I'm still pursuing this as best I can in court.
I know it's been a really, like you said, uphill battle because they have all the resources, they have all the money to somehow defend what they have done. But I know we all appreciate you pressing forward with it because it is so important that this kind of action cannot and should not stand. That being noted, are there other investigative pieces and reports that you've done because you've had this experience that have made you kind of nervous about being targeted in other ways?
Well, I just assume now that I'm targeted. I knew for years before this that there were other ways I was targeted through smear campaigns and campaigns to try to discredit the reporting. I saw the rise of these organized tactics by corporate interests, beginning with the pharmaceutical industry, but extending far beyond that now to many different interests of corporations and political figures. And may I note that the spying on me was not significant because it was me. Sometimes people will say, well, what makes you think you're so important? I'm like, well, first of all, I'm not the one who chose to spy on me. But second of all, they're doing this to thousands of people. And one former agent involved in the spying on me said that he personally, I think there's many operations, but in one operation alone, knew of thousands of people they were doing this to. And many journalists, I'm sure, were involved. I just happen to have the contacts and sources and forensics experts that were able to prove it. Most people wouldn't know. This kind of surveillance is often very invisible. And if you don't have a tip and contacts, then you wouldn't know it. And it's important because if we had, and if the press had done something about this at the time and spoken of it, maybe we wouldn't have seen the abuses that happened in 2016 and continue today. That's why it's so important. Until these government figures and federal agencies are held accountable and people are prosecuted for what they've done wrong, why would they stop? And I've come to believe, Christy, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but the federal agencies have now outgrown the federal government in terms of the overseers. Congress can't really do anything and doesn't do anything meaningful about the abuses by federal agencies because they're co-opted, both Democrat and Republican Party leaders through donations and all kinds of influence. And really, they're not running the show anymore. These bureaucracies that are committing the abuses are in charge.
Well, the whole thing is scary, just even how our judicial system is run. Now you have certain people out there, like one of our own representatives, supposedly AOC, talking about Supreme Court decisions that they maybe just will ignore. I mean, it's just like this embrace of complete lawlessness. But I did also want to ask you in terms of the journalism aspect and the book, The Smear, which is the one I'm reading again. Um, this method that they use to shut people down. I'm a registered independent because I have been in news for about 20 years. I always tried, of course, to be fair and neutral and even in my own politics. But as soon as I stepped away from that, anytime I point out the counter narrative, people will call you MAGA, that you're far right, just for not towing the narrative. So what have you done to have your to resist that, to uphold your integrity and not just be reduced to, oh, you're just now MAGA?
Well, you simply have to not put too much credence in those voices. And it's hard because they dominate. They've understood how a small group of people can dominate the narratives on social media and the internet, make it feel like everybody thinks something. But I have a broad and diverse set of contacts, and I understand that when they're saying something on social media and you're getting hit by a bunch of people, oftentimes through uh, led by paid companies that have fake accounts, or they're real accounts but in fake names, and it looks like people are coming after you, but it's an organized effort by PR firms who work for people. Once you understand the system, you're not as intimidated by it, and nor are you as, in my view, subjected to it as far as influence, because you can say that that's just a manipulated voice. That's not really what most people think. And I find when I talk to ordinary people, they appreciate the reporting I do. They certainly understand that today, if you simply do fair reporting, those forces and propagandists will tend to label you as right leaning, because that's a way to discredit, not let people listen to the fair and neutral view. That's a strategy. But again, if you just understand it and keep your nose to the grindstone and don't try to react to that, I think you can overcome it. And left-leaning journalists, like overtly left-leaning journalists, like Glenn Greenwald of The Intercept, who left his own news organization when they wouldn't let him report on the Hunter Biden controversy, they've understood too, and they are far from right-leaning, and yet they too are grouped into the right-leaning category simply for sometimes speaking truth that doesn't cut well with the left. So I think people are starting to see this now and be able to think for themselves. Sorry about the dogs barking.
I was going to say, they're so upset about this too. I mean, they get it. This is just outlandish that this is happening. Your most recent book, Slanted: How the News Media Taught Us to Love Censorship and Hate Journalism When the Facts Don't Fit Their Narrative. In that book, I just made that a whole sentence. So your book is called Slanted: How the News Media Taught Us to Love Censorship and Hate Journalism. But in that book, or in the promotion of that book, it says when the facts don't fit their narrative, the media abandons the facts, not the narrative, which I just think is such a great way to put it. So I have struggled with the motivations of journalists that are going along with it, because I think one thing that kind of brings journalists together is we all have this curiosity and this desire to look into things and tell people stories. And then, but when it comes to what's happened, and whether it started in 2016 or 2020, um, you just see almost this tribalism, and that's the only thing I can think of it to make sense of, like, why there's so many journalists that aren't speaking out about these issues more. And I know it's journalists work long hours, they work on holidays. We've had to be defensive of people saying, oh, you're fake news. We've had to be defensive about oh, it's just I can't watch the news because it's so negative. So I've been trying to make sense of this, and it's like, do you think it is like a tribalism? Like, we've kind of like been in this club of understanding the difficulties of journalism. And so now when it's under attack, you just have those that will, in a tribal nature, go along with the narrative just to stay in the club, or what do you think it is?
I think it's a complicated formula, but some of the factors at play have to do with look at what is rewarded. At CBS News, I've told many anecdotes in my books about accurately reporting stories, and then coming for years that was rewarded and encouraged most of my career at CBS. But there came a time when there were certain editorial figures at CBS who didn't want us, not just me, to report certain things. It became very clear the way they would try to edit the scripts and edit the truth out of some of them and change the facts. And it's very difficult to go up against your boss, especially if you're not established. I was at CBS News. It's very difficult to say to someone who's in the chain of command between you and publishing a story, to say to them, that's not true. What you're changing the story to say didn't happen and isn't accurate. And understand that that means your career may not advance. They may not sign you to another contract. We get paid a lot of money to do what we do at the network. So I think there are choices to be made. These things weren't just happening to me, but other journalists made choices. Maybe they weren't in a position to quit mid-contract as I did. Maybe sometimes they philosophically agree with the bend that's coming down editorially, so they're happy to abandon their journalistic standards that made them at one point try to report more fairly. Maybe they're perfectly happy to grasp unfair reporting. To them, it's maybe the way they'd rather do things. So I think there's a lot of that at stake. I will tell you that I have colleagues at major newspapers like the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and the networks who still try to do good, accurate, fair reporting on some topics and are not allowed. They will start reporting a story and their local bosses will like it, but the story will ultimately never get published. Someone up the line stops it, and they start to learn intuitively, well, Why am I going to pursue those stories? I will pursue other kinds of stories that get me pats on the back, that get me ahead, that get me published, that make headlines. It's sort of a way to, people are treated in a way that they're rewarded for doing this kind of reporting that you and I don't like, and they're punished for doing what we think of as the fair and accurate reporting of the past.
And then when they're caught, we still don't have any answers. I'm remembering the NBC News story. I wish I could remember the reporter's name offhand, but he had done a story on the Paul Pelosi attack. And then suddenly, within days, you couldn't find it. It was completely removed and he was suspended. And then the body cam footage came out and more additional information came back. I had saved the story, watched it again, and there was nothing wrong with the story. It was factually correct. So, and NBC has still never answered for why they suspended him. I think his name, no, I'm not going to guess his name, but it's just
Well,
crazy how
you
they
know,
can get away with it.
I looked into that a little bit. I wondered the same thing you did. And I try not to comment if I don't have some insight or haven't looked at something. And I did look at that. And there were some fine points of his early reporting that did seem to conflict with what had happened. And one of them was, and you're going back to something that was some months ago. So,
Yeah.
you know, maybe I'm not being as precise as I'd like to be. But I believe he said something about in the beginning that when the door was opened, or that Paul Pelosi opened the door and then stepped back toward his attacker, and then was attacked. And that's not what we saw in the body cam video. The door seemed to swing open by itself or through a third party or through some automatic sense. Paul Pelosi and the attacker were both together touching each other. So Paul Pelosi did not answer the door and then step or walk back to the attacker as if he was unafraid. And that had been a key part of that initial NBC report, that why would Paul Pelosi step back toward a guy if he was afraid of him? Well, that's not what the body cam video ultimately showed. And that may be one of the discrepancies that seems tiny, but it may be one that legitimately in this case was off point. And someone found that out after the NBC report said this is off point as to what the body cam video shows, and they retracted the report.
Fair enough. With the future of journalism, what do you think are the most important stories right now that you think should be getting more attention? Because what we frequently see happen is one major story will dominate the news cycle and they'll bring it to you to death, and then we'll miss other things. What do you think are the most important issues, stories right now that should get more coverage?
The control and manipulation of our information, the control of our federal agencies over us in a way that doesn't benefit the public and isn't desired by the public, and that equates to our foreign policy, our domestic policy. The Ukraine Russia war, which is not being appropriately reported, that's being reported as black and white without a lot of the nuances that are very critical. The waste, fraud, and abuse of our taxpayer money, which is ongoing in every federal agency that exists. And yet there's no proposals ever to reform the agencies or to figure out how to stop it. It's just sort of accepted. And then I always say one of the number one things on the list is the link between vaccines and not only autism, but all kinds of chronic diseases, proven in peer-reviewed published works, admitted by government scientists and agencies and officials in ways you will never read about unless you go to my website, perhaps. But that is a huge scandal because our country is full of young people who are aging and starting to get new and huge outbreaks of chronic diseases that are killing our society, that our federal agencies like FDA are ignoring, I think, for follow the money type reasons. But there's all kinds of things going on with our health, and not just due to vaccines, but due to medicines and pesticides and exposures that we get in our everyday life that the government is not only allowing, but encouraging, that's basically impacting virtually every child in America and all of us as we eat this adulterated food and try to figure out why so many of us are suffering from these autoimmune disorders and cancers and things that were never seen, especially in children, in these numbers before the past about 20 years.
Absolutely. And if you want to make sure that you see those important stories, make sure you bookmark SharylAttkisson.com, her website, because she's bringing those stories to the forefront. And you can find any of those amazing books of Sharyl's on Amazon. And are there any other ways we can support your work before we say goodbye?
Well, thank you. I do try to cross post what I write at SharylAttkisson.com, but you can see, if you don't watch my TV show, you can go to fullmeasure.news and see any of the segments. or go to SharylAttkisson.com and click Full Measure and watch all the cover stories, good old fashioned across the world. I've been covering stories of interest and importance to all of us that are largely being ignored by the mainstream media. And we're covering these stories in an old fashioned, fair way that takes them on the way they're supposed to be taken on and explores and examines them so that people can make up their own minds about them.
What a novel idea in journalism to allow people to make up their own minds. Well, thank you so much for coming on with me. I really, really appreciate your time. We'll let you get back to your pool and your dogs, and hopefully you can join us again another time.
Well, thank you so much for having me.